2 days before Kyle Busch died, Richard Petty reportedly received a message that didn't make any sense. Not because the words were confusing, but because the person those words were about still seemed completely untouchable. Kyle was still racing, still winning, still the same aggressive, polarizing force he had always been. A man who had spent more than 2 decades making NASCAR fans either love him completely or despise everything about him. There was no middle ground with Kyle Busch. There never had been. So when that message arrived, Petty reportedly set it aside. Because nothing about Kyle looked finished. Nothing about him looked fragile. And nothing in that moment gave anyone in the sport any real reason to believe that one of NASCAR's greatest competitors was running out of time. Then the news came, and it hit the racing world like a wall at full speed. For days after Kyle Busch passed away, Richard Petty went quiet, completely silent. In a sport where legends always have something to say, that silence felt strange. Fans demanded answers. Rumors started spreading everywhere, across social media, through the garage, in every corner of NASCAR's world. How does a driver who just celebrated in victory lane suddenly vanish forever? Why had Kyle kept pushing himself when there were reportedly serious physical problems building behind the scenes? What had really been happening in those final weeks? When Petty finally spoke, what he revealed wasn't just a tribute. It was something far more honest than that. And once you hear the full story, the real story, not just the headlines, you may never look at Kyle Busch quite the same way again. Kyle Busch's final week feels almost impossible to process now, looking back at it. 6 days before his death, he was standing in victory lane, celebrating another Truck Series win, grinning, confident, doing exactly what he had always done. Fans watching that moment saw the same driver they had followed for years, fast, fearless, impossible to slow down. Nobody standing in that crowd would have guessed they were watching one of Kyle Busch's final public moments as a racing competitor. But behind that celebration, things were reportedly far more serious than anyone understood. Reports that emerged after his death revealed that Kyle had been dealing with physical issues in the days and weeks leading up to that final race weekend, including what was described as a severe sinus condition that had apparently forced him to seek medical treatment during that very period. Most professional athletes in that situation step back. They rest. They protect themselves. They listen to their bodies. Kyle Busch kept racing anyway. And according to Richard Petty, that decision wasn't stubbornness for the sake of stubbornness. It was something much deeper than that. It was the way Kyle had always operated, going all the way back to the very beginning of his career. He didn't know any other way to exist in this sport. Slowing down wasn't in his vocabulary. Admitting weakness wasn't something he was capable of doing in front of the racing world. That mindset, Petty reportedly said, revealed everything about who Kyle truly was. Then came May 20th, 2026. Kyle arrived at a simulator facility in North Carolina, the kind of routine preparation visit that happens dozens of times a season. Just another day of work before another race weekend. Nobody thought anything of it. He was Kyle Busch. He was always working, always preparing, always grinding toward the next Sunday. Hours after he walked into that facility, emergency crews rushed him to a hospital in Charlotte. And by the following afternoon, NASCAR confirmed the news that no one in the sport was prepared to receive. Kyle Busch was gone, 41 years old. Gone. What stunned Richard Petty most, beyond the grief, beyond the shock of the moment, was how fast everything happened. There was no warning that the entire sport could see. There was no slowdown, no farewell, no moment where anyone could have said their piece and told Kyle what he meant to them. 1 week he was in victory lane. The next, NASCAR was trying to figure out how to exist without him. Richard Petty had known Kyle Busch for a long time. Long before the championships. Long before the headlines. Long before Kyle became one of the most recognized names not just in NASCAR, but in all of American sports. Petty watched a young driver enter the Cup Series and immediately divide every single person in the garage. Some drivers respected his talent right away, the raw speed, the precision, the instinct for finding the fastest line through any corner. Others saw something dangerous in him. Reckless, selfish, a driver who raced like he was the only car on the track. But Petty reportedly understood something most people missed during those early years. Kyle wasn't just racing the cars in front of him. He was racing something inside himself. Every single week. According to people who were close to the sport during that era, Petty believed from very early on that Kyle carried something personal with him every time he put on that helmet. A need to prove himself that didn't diminish as the wins piled up. A fire that grew hotter the more successful he became, rather than cooling down the way you might expect success to make a person feel. Even after becoming one of the most accomplished drivers in NASCAR history, well over 200 victories across all 3 national series, Kyle still drove like a man who had something left to prove. Like the critics were still watching. Like the doubters still needed silencing. The wins brought fame. They brought money. They brought a legacy that most drivers would dream about for their entire careers. But they also created a set of expectations that became heavier with every passing season. When you win as much as Kyle Busch won, second place starts feeling like failure. When the entire sport watches you every Sunday, every mistake gets magnified 1,000 times over. Richard Petty reportedly believed that weight never left Kyle. That constant pressure to be great, not just good, not just competitive, but truly dominant, slowly changes a person mentally over time. It builds in ways you can't always see from the outside. And from the outside, Kyle always looked like he was thriving under pressure. That was part of what made him so compelling to watch. But what Petty understood, and what many fans never fully grasped, was what that performance was costing him. By the middle of his career, Kyle Busch had become something bigger than just a NASCAR driver. He was the sport's most controversial superstar. The driver everyone had an opinion about. The name that could clear a room or start a fight, depending on which fans were in that room. His rivalries became legendary. With Kevin Harvick, it was always combustible. 2 intensely competitive drivers who seemed to bring out the worst and the best in each other, depending on the week. With Denny Hamlin, it was complicated in the way only long friendships inside a ruthlessly competitive sport can be. And with Dale Earnhardt Jr., it was something different entirely, because Jr. represented everything the NASCAR fanbase loved most, and Kyle represented everything that made them uncomfortable. When Kyle raced at tracks where the crowds were stacked against him, the booing was loud enough to feel like a physical thing. Rowdy Nation fired back. The chaos in the grandstands mirrored the chaos on the track. And Kyle, to his credit, never shrank from it. He leaned into the villain role when the villain role served him. He turned the hostility into fuel and used it to go faster. Richard Petty reportedly believed fans never truly understood the mental cost of maintaining that image for over 20 years. Think about what that actually means. Every race weekend, Kyle Busch stepped into a world where a significant portion of the audience wanted him to fail, where rivals were actively gunning for him, where the media was waiting for the next controversial moment to dissect, where the pressure to perform wasn't just professional, it was personal, public, and relentless. And Kyle gave that world exactly what it expected, week after week, year after year, even when the pressure behind closed doors became something else entirely. That relentless quality was the thing that made him legendary. Petty reportedly said it plainly. But it was also, he believed, the thing that slowly wore Kyle down in ways nobody could see until it was too late. Away from the track, there was a version of Kyle Busch that the television cameras rarely captured. Richard Petty reportedly admitted that fatherhood changed Kyle in ways the public never fully appreciated. The aggressive, take-no-prisoners driver that fans saw every Sunday was still completely present once that helmet went on. But at home, in the private world he built with Samantha and their children, something softened. Brexton came first. And from the moment that boy showed any interest in racing, Kyle became something fans almost never got to see. A proud, emotional father who poured as much intensity into supporting his son as he had ever put into his own career. Fans got glimpses of it at youth races, in social media posts, in the way Kyle's face changed when someone asked him about Brexton versus when someone asked him about his own championship chances. The professional competitor disappeared. A completely different kind of fire showed up in its place. Then Lennox arrived, and people who were close to the family reportedly noticed Kyle becoming softer than he had ever been publicly. More present, more emotional, more openly grateful for the life he had built away from the racetrack. That context makes what happened 2 days before his death so difficult to sit with. 2 days before everything changed, Kyle posted a birthday message for Brexton. Simple words. The kind of thing any proud father might write. He talked about how proud he was of his son and said there was no limit to what that boy could accomplish. At the time, to anyone scrolling past it, It looked like a normal family post, the kind that gets a few thousand likes and disappears into the feed. Now, those words carry a completely different weight. Now, NASCAR fans read that message and feel something that doesn't have a simple name. But even as that private world was becoming more meaningful to Kyle, serious pressures were reportedly mounting behind the scenes. In 2024, Kyle and Samantha became involved in a legal battle after what court filings described as a significant financial loss. Millions of dollars allegedly caught up in what the filings characterized as a financial trap. For someone who had built not just a racing career but a series of businesses and investments, that kind of stress doesn't stay in a boardroom. It follows you everywhere. Into the garage, into the car, into every simulator session and pre-race meeting. At the same time, Kyle's body had absorbed more than 20 years of NASCAR punishment. The crashes, the endless travel, the physical toll of competing at the highest level of motorsport for 2 straight decades. Reports after his death suggested he had been dealing with that severe sinus condition for some time before the end came. And still, he kept racing. Richard Petty reportedly connected that refusal to slow down with something specific, the old-school NASCAR culture that many of the sport's greatest drivers were raised in. The culture that says you push through pain. You don't let anyone see weakness. You show up on Sunday, no matter what you're dealing with during the week. Kyle was a product of that culture in every possible way. He never wanted anyone to think he was fading. He never wanted to give rivals or critics the satisfaction of seeing him step back. So he kept going, kept competing, kept acting like everything was completely under control, even as the pressure around him grew heavier and heavier. Looking back now, many people in the sport believe the warning signs were there. They just didn't look like warning signs at the time. When the news broke, the garage froze. Not the kind of pause that lasts a few seconds before life picks back up. A real, extended, stunned silence that spread through NASCAR like a cold front moving across the whole country at once. Kyle Busch had entered that simulator facility in North Carolina like it was the most ordinary day of the racing calendar. Preparation. Focus. The next race was always the most important race. That was how he operated. Hours later, emergency crews were rushing him to a hospital in Charlotte, and nobody in the garage had any idea what was happening or how serious it truly was. First came the words, severe illness. That was all anyone knew. And the panic that followed those 2 words was immediate and total. Drivers called each other. Team members tried to get information. Social media filled up with prayers, speculation, confusion. The garage, which is usually a controlled and professional environment no matter what else is happening in the world, stopped functioning the way it normally does. And then on May 21st, 2026, NASCAR confirmed it. Kyle Busch was gone. Richard Petty reportedly struggled to find a way to process how fast it all happened. Kyle's name was still on the entry list for the Coca-Cola 600. His car was still ready. His team was still preparing for Sunday. Just days earlier, he had been standing in victory lane doing the thing he had done more than 200 times before, looking as alive and competitive and unstoppable as he always had. The distance between that moment and this one was almost impossible to measure. As tributes flooded in from across the sport, something remarkable happened. Drivers who had spent years battling Kyle on the track, men who had traded paint with him, feuded with him, publicly criticized him, spoke about his death with a rawness that surprised even longtime NASCAR observers. Dale Earnhardt Jr., who had perhaps the most complicated public relationship with Kyle of anyone in the sport, spoke with genuine emotion. Denny Hamlin, who had raced alongside Kyle for years as both teammate and rival, said things that made clear the depth of what the garage had actually lost. Kevin Harvick, whose battles with Kyle had been some of the most intense of the modern era, called him irreplaceable. The driver who had been booed at tracks across America was suddenly being described by those same rivals in terms that sounded like admiration, like grief, like loss. Richard Petty's response, though, hit differently than all the others. Instead of focusing on the championships and the record books, and there was certainly enough there to fill the tribute, Petty reportedly chose to expose the side of Kyle that most fans never truly understood. He talked about the intensity, the pressure, the mental cost of competing at that level with that personality in that sport for that long. He talked about a driver who turned every race into something personal, who used every criticism as motivation, who never once allowed himself to coast on what he had already accomplished. And then Petty reportedly said something that made the entire tragedy feel even more final. Kyle Busch's last victory came 6 days before his death. He never got a farewell tour. There was no final lap around the track at a favorite venue. No emotional press conference where the sport could gather and say everything that needed to be said. He climbed out of a winning truck without knowing it was the last time he would ever climb out of a winning truck. He walked away from victory lane not knowing it was the last time he would ever stand there. That's the part that doesn't fully compute, even now. Richard Petty reportedly believes NASCAR may never see another driver quite like Kyle Busch. Not just because of the numbers, though the numbers are staggering. More than 234 victories across NASCAR's National Series, 2 Cup Series championships, a career that statistically places him among the greatest competitors the sport has ever produced. But the numbers aren't the real reason Petty said what he said. It's the way Kyle attacked every single race like it was personal. Like the outcome of that specific Sunday genuinely mattered to him in a way that went beyond points and standings and championship mathematics. He raced with a fire that very few drivers have ever been able to sustain, not just for a season or two, but across an entire career spanning more than 2 decades. That fire shaped the sport in ways that will take years to fully understand. Drivers like William Byron and Christopher Bell were given their first real opportunities through Kyle Busch Motorsports, the racing organization Kyle built outside of his Cup program to develop young talent. Both men became stars. Both men carried something of Kyle's philosophy with them as they built their own careers. Younger drivers throughout the garage studied Kyle's aggression, his confidence, his absolute refusal to back down from any situation regardless of the pressure involved. Even drivers who disliked him personally understood that competing against him made them better because Kyle never gave anyone anything for free. That legacy is already moving forward. Anyone who has watched Brexton Busch race at the youth level has seen something that stops them in their tracks. The same hunger, the same intensity, the same look in his eyes when the green flag drops that his father had been carrying since he was old enough to fit in a go-kart. Richard Petty reportedly said it simply. The sport may have lost Kyle Busch, but it hasn't lost the fire he created inside the next generation of racers chasing greatness. In the end, Richard Petty's silence in those first days after Kyle's death may have communicated something that words couldn't quite reach. Because even the legends of NASCAR, the men who have seen everything this sport has to offer, who have lived through its greatest triumphs and its most devastating tragedies, even those men struggled to understand how someone who looked completely unstoppable one week could simply be gone the next. Kyle Busch spent his entire life refusing to slow down. That refusal made him one of the most extraordinary drivers the sport has ever produced. It built a legacy that will be studied and discussed and debated for as long as NASCAR exists. But it may have also been the very pressure he never found a way to escape. What makes this story so painful isn't just the loss. It's how unfinished everything felt. Kyle was still racing, still winning, still preparing for the next Sunday the same way he always had, because that was the only way he knew how to exist in this world. He never got the long goodbye that most legends eventually receive. No farewell season, no final emotional lap, just one last victory, 6 days before everything changed. And 2 days before the end, without knowing what was coming, he sat down and wrote a few words to his son. He told Brexton there was no limit to what he could accomplish. Those words carry a different meaning now. They always will. Somewhere out there right now, a kid is sitting in a go-kart with dirt on his face and fire in his eyes, chasing a standard that Kyle Busch spent his entire life building. And according to Richard Petty, nobody would have wanted it any other way.